I really appreciate the opportunity to come along and speak to this group today. I do have a bit of stuff to cover, so I'm going to try to run through it as quickly as I can. And as Wayne said, it's particularly neat for me to come along and speak to this group because I spent a bit of time here at Victoria myself, done a bit of study, and I have a lot of fond memories of this place personally as well. So what I'm going to present to you today is essentially a reworked version of presentations that I was invited to give to the Ministry for the Environment and also the Ministry for Primary Industries. And it's based on PhD research, as Wayne alluded to, in environmental science that I completed through the University of Auckland a bit over a year ago now. And just from the outset, I'd really like to acknowledge the scholarship funding that I received for that research from the University of Auckland and also from my employer at the time, which was Boffa Miskell. What my thesis essentially did was it looked at how we currently understand introduced wildlife in New Zealand, thought a little bit about how our understandings about many of these species have developed over time, how they were in the past, and thought a little bit more about how those understandings may come to change in future as well. And a big part of my research was fundamentally asking whether we might take a more accepting or a more conciliatory approach to many of our introduced species, and even in some cases to some species that we might currently consider to be pests. Something that international visitors often remark on when they come to New Zealand is New Zealanders' intense love for many of our introduced species, and particularly our bird life. But something that they also remark on is New Zealanders' intense hatred and loathing for many species that we've introduced, and especially any species that contradict the interests of our bird life. So it's something that comes through very clearly for me in the conservation literature in comparison to elsewhere. We tend to have quite an extreme attitude towards this sort of stuff. We tend to take it very, very seriously. And that attitude is supported by a very polarised construction of nature itself, which tends to present these two things of native and introduced in quite a, as I say, polarised way. And this way of framing our environment can make it difficult and, dare I say it, often controversial for people to express views that are compassionate, that are positive, and that are even respectful for many of our introduced species. What I can say is that having studied and worked in the environmental sector and the industry for some years now, it's very difficult to have conversations about conservation in New Zealand. It's at least those that sit outside of the norm. And it's actually something that I think we have a real problem with in this country, and that I'm going to speak about a little bit more in just a minute. So just to get us started, I just want to start off with, how did I get here? And by that, I don't mean did I take the bus or did I take a cab or whatever. I mean more in terms of my career progression, how I got to be sort of standing in front of you talking today. And probably the place to start would be back in 1998 when I began my bachelor's studies here at Vic. I did a Bachelor of Science in Biology, and I also did a commerce degree. I did the conjoint thing. Some of you will be doing something similar. I then took a year off, taught English in South Korea. I had a bit of a gap year and took some time off. I came back to Victoria and I did a Masters of Science in Ecology and Biodiversity. And the sort of thesis component I did under Casey Burns, which many of you will have had as a lecturer, and some of you may have as a supervisor. I did a wide range of part-time work throughout my studies, both my bachelor's and particularly my master's, working at places like the Kiwitu National Trust, industry places like Seafood New Zealand, the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, other sort of government sort of roles. And in the final year of my master's, I began working for Boffa Miskell, which is an environmental design consultancy, first doing bird surveys for what's now become the Markra Wind Farm out there on the west coast. And once I'd finished my master's, I travelled up then to Auckland, and then I spent about six and a half years working as an ecologist for Boffa Miskell, mostly doing ecological impact assessment work, working on big projects, wind farms, roads, property development, and other things like that. So one thing that really struck me while doing this kind of work, and that still strikes me to this day, is the basis that we use for valuing wildlife the way that we do in New Zealand. With impact assessment work, sometimes you work in pristine environments and relatively untouched areas, but more often than not, you're working in ecosystems that are a little more rougher around the edges, it's fair to say. And often you're working in urban or peri-urban environments, and the ecosystems are a real mix there, generally of native and introduced, a lot of common native species, and your fair share of pests and weeds as well. And the scheme of valuation that we work under in New Zealand is basically this, and this is an extremely simplified version of it. At the top of the pyramid is your threatened or at-risk native species or ecosystems. And these things you cannot put a bulldozer through. These things you're going to need to avoid, or you're going to need to offer up some sort of mitigation for if you're going to damage or modify them. Next, and it's some way down, quite some way down the pyramid from there, your common native species. And these are things that you probably actually are going to be able to put the bulldozer through, so long as you can show that they're definitely common, that there's plenty of them around. Basically, the more successful they are, the less they're considered worth protecting in New Zealand. Next, in some very, very considerable way further down, there's your introduced species. And these ones are generally considered to have no particular value or in terms of biodiversity value in New Zealand, so long as they're not game species. So no real problem putting the bulldozer through those ones either. And finally, you have your weed and pest species, which, as you'll be well aware, you're essentially incentivised to destroy. So it's a scheme of valuation overall that ensures that under most circumstances it's going to be pretty easy actually to put the bulldozer through it. Occasionally you'll find some threatened or at-risk species or ecosystem, but really by their very nature being rare and uncommon, you don't tend to run into them too often. And in many respects, for me, it's a very perverse system, leading to exactly the kinds of biodiversity outcomes that you would expect. And what also increasingly bugged me, and what still bugs me, is that many ecosystems that we'll happily bulldoze, our novel, mixed, hybrid ecosystems, are those that make up most of our ecosystems in New Zealand. What's worse, these are some of the most diverse, vibrant, and dynamic systems that we have in this country. Despite the contributions of disciplines like urban and landscape ecology over many years now, we're still really conditioned as ecologists to be looking for the native and the pristine all the time. When for me it's really the mongrel, bastard, mixed up ecosystems that are often some of the most interesting out there. And I thought, and I still think, that we don't have a strong basis sometimes for being so dismissive of many of these novel ecosystems and many of the species that sit within them and the values that they support as well. So anyway, some of these thoughts later became the seeds of my PhD thesis and my research in that area. And just briefly to complete the career history, in the last 6 months of my PhD, I travelled back down here to Wellington to take up a role with Greater Wellington, and I now work as a senior advisor in their biodiversity department. So I'm working more on the policy and planning aspects of biodiversity management now. I've sort of moved a little bit out of the more technical space. But anyway, to return to my research, I went into the PhD really thinking, as many PhDs do in their early stages, that I had some pretty groundbreaking ideas to share, pretty earth-shattering ideas that I was going to build on. I thought that I was going to be maybe the next Darwin or something, really special like that. So it was with more than a little bit of horror that I came to realise, really in the first 2 to 3 months of my studies, when I was doing the literature review stage and doing a lot of reading, that I wasn't nearly as original as I thought that I was. And in fact, what I found was that many others in the literature, and a whole range of literatures, were also having these sort of semi-heretical thoughts about ecology and about nature. Many of them many years before I had. So what I found was that there were a whole range of literatures, not just in ecology and elsewhere in the natural sciences, but also in the social sciences and the humanities and the arts, across geography, environmental history, philosophy, sociology, you name it. People were talking about how we think about nature, and they were thinking quite a lot about how introduced species fits into our ideas about nature. I was actually a bit daunted to find that there'd been this explosion of nature-related discussion and research over the last couple of decades. And many of these people were just as sceptical about the validity of many of the ways that we currently think about nature as I was. So some of the papers that I shared with you, a couple of them that I shared with you, one by Charles Warren, another one by Mark Sagoff, for example, are about trying to open up your mind a little bit to some of these different literatures that are going on. The papers that I shared were across geography, environmental history and philosophy. So what really struck me learning this stuff was this enormous difference as well between what people understood in the literature, and that had changed quite a lot in the last 20 years, and what people think in the public, and even what people think out there in industry as well. And the question that I asked myself is, why didn't I already know all of this stuff that had been written? And I thought about that a little bit more, and I thought about the disjunct in information and understanding in this space. And I came to the conclusion that a lot of it comes down to the means of disseminating the information. I was reading all of the stuff as you would at PhD level and journal articles, and the problem with that is that in the main, most people, in fact, don't read journal articles. In fact, just to give you some numbers, the total number of peer-reviewed journal articles being produced every year now is about 1.5 million. That's every year across something like 26,000 journals. The fact of the matter is that your average journal is likely to be read in its entirety by no more than about 10 people. And if you go through those 10 people, there's yourself, there's your supervisor, there's your two editors, there's your mum and your dad, there's your girlfriend, maybe your boyfriend as well, and then there's a couple of people who are going to read your average paper. Some papers are going to do much better than that, of course, but that's just talking about your average. Fully half of journal articles are read only by their authors and editors. A third are never cited by anyone. And the really crucial thing is that most practitioners working in the field do not read journal articles. I have a pile of journal articles sitting on my desk. People think I'm extremely smart. My pile gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year. The reason for that is I never read them. I never get any time to. I read occasional ones, but very infrequently. So what I suppose I've been doing since finishing my PhD is trying to move out of the academic sort of realm a little bit, although also dabbling a bit in that, trying to get more into popular writing, mostly because I think that the biggest and most important task really now is to try to educate people a little bit about some of the changes that have gone on in the literature in the last few decades. And in general, in my view, most practitioners working in the field are theoretically probably about 20 to 30 years out of date and behind the literature. And I think that this has some really serious consequences for how we're continually managing and thinking about our ecosystems.